We're going to try and start on time. My name's Rick Serrayo, the principal and a director, and I sell a couple of properties here and there at Raine and Horne Real Estate. We'd like to thank you for attending tonight. There's, together with George Caravanas and this very, very famous ex-lawyer. I just don't know how long the bio is. John Comino. There's been a lot of, since the reforms have come through, there's been a lot of misinformation. We've spoken to a few journalists about why they're not covering stories. They just want to know who's...
Rick?
Oh no. I'm not going to talk for very long. They're just interested in the gossip rather than the reality of what's happening and changing people's lives at the moment. We've had a lot of inquiries from a lot of different people, whether they're thinking of selling or whether they're developers, or just trying to understand some of the ramifications that's occurring out there. Am I going to get 6 to 8 stories? My neighbour's just sold. Do I have to sell? Am I in the zone? Am I not in the zone? So we thought we'd just be a little bit proactive, and I thank everyone for their time. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Bathrooms to my left-hand side. There's also some water on the table at the back. George has been good enough to bring out some plans as well with some of the zoning. I thought we might start with George having a fairly lengthy conversation about the reforms. John's also here from a legal point of view if you've got some questions there. We've got some really established high-profile Bromycids here, some high-profile architects in the room as well. And I think there's some sellers, there's some developers, so deals are going to be done tonight. Just joking. I think tonight is really important that if you have a question and a concern that you might be thinking, someone else might be thinking, so there's no dumb questions tonight, but this is a free forum. We are going to be taping it, but we're not taping anyone in the room. It's just because a lot of our elderly clients that weren't so mobile couldn't make it tonight, so we're going to edit it and then send it back out. Thanks everyone, I'll pass it over to George.
Thank you, Rick. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure how well versed you are with these changes.
Can everyone hear in the back?
No.
Would you mind going to the microphone? Yeah.
Is that better?
Just give me a test. Yeah, we're on.
Does work, doesn't it?
So you talk quite loud.
So I got. Do I have
Needs
to?
to be a bit higher near your mouth.
I'm not that tall. So 3 weeks ago, the state government introduced the LMRs, and the LMR stands for low to medium density housing. Low being 1 to 2 stories, medium being 3 to 6 stories. What that did was, as I said 3 weeks ago, it identified about 170 centres within New South Wales, Sydney, and as well as some outer areas, and it identified those centres as the nucleus around where these provisions would be occurring. Is that better?
You might just lean into it.
Okay. So you have a series of centres, and then there are a number of criteria as to whether your property is included in these uplifts, and I'll go through this quite methodically. The centres themselves are not included as part of these reforms. It's the area outside the centres. In other words, these reforms only apply to the R1, R2, R3 and R4 zones. They are the residential zones only, okay? So if you are within 400 or 800 metres of these particular centres, you could be up for some of those uplifts. I'll explain how these work. Firstly, there are 2 types of zones in the areas that this group of people is mainly interested in. They are the R2 zone and the R3 zone, and perhaps the R4 zone. The R2 zone is a low density zone. In other words, where you can only have houses or duplexes, okay? The R3 zone is where you can have your apartment buildings, right? So in terms of the R2 zone, firstly, if you are within 800 metres of a centre, and let's pick a centre, Double Bay Centre, Edgecliff Centre, Rose Bay Centre, and you can be 800 metres from the periphery of those centres. You can have a dual occupancy, in other words, a duplex. If you have a lot size of more than 450 square metres, if you have a lot width of more than 12 metres, then what you get is a floor space ratio, in other words, the density, at 0.65 to 1. What that means is the current controls give you about 0.5 to 1. So if you have a site area of 1,000 square metres, you get 500 square metres of floor space. Under these controls, you'll get 650, right? And you get a height of 9.5 metres, which is 2 or 3 stories. What these provisions also do for the R2 zone, in other words, the low density zone, is that it also allows new uses to come in that were not permissible previously. Such uses are multi-dwelling housing, like terraces or townhouses, as well as residential flat buildings, which are your apartments. So if with the multi-dwelling housing, in other words, the townhouses, you will need a minimum site area of 500 metres to 600 metres, depending on the type of dwellings that you're doing. And you get an FSR, a floor space ratio, of 0.7 to 1. So back on that example, you get 700 square metres of floor space. You need to have a width of 12 metres to 18 metres, depending on the type of dwellings you're proposing. The more interesting or the more radical change for the R2 zone is that it, as I said, introduces residential flat buildings, your apartments, your flats, okay? So you can have flats in an R2 zone. To have a flat block of flats in an R2 zone, you need a minimum site area. Your block has to be a minimum of 500 square metres, and it has to have a width of 12 metres as a minimum. On that basis, you get 0.8 to 1. So if you have 1,000 square metres of site area, you get 800 square metres of floor space and a height of 9.5 metres, which is 2 stories plus an attic style development. They're the changes that apply to the R2 zone. And as I said, 0 to 800 metres. If you're in that zone, you can apply those controls. Just to clarify, those controls sit above the council's planning controls. The council's planning controls currently, generally for an R2 zone, are 0.5 to 1 FSR and 9.5 metres in height. This goes over and above those controls. For the R3 and the R4 zones, in other words, the apartment zones, there are greater changes. There is a differentiation. As I said previously, you have your 0 to 800 metres for your R2 zone. Here they've broken it up into 2 segments. There is one category which is 0 to 400 metres, and the other is 400 to 800 metres. I'll start with the 0 to 400 first. So if you're within 400 metres of one of these centres and you're in an R3 zone, you get a floor space ratio of 2.2 to 1. So back on that example of if you have 1,000 square metres of site area, you get 2,200 square metres of floor space. You get a height of 22 metres or 6 stories. Okay, so the difference there is, currently in these R3 zones, generally speaking, you get 3 stories and about 1 to 1 or in that vicinity. This now doubles to 6 stories as well as 2.2 to 1.
George, could I interrupt you?
Of course.
22 metres, 6 stories. Is it possible 22 metres could be 7 or 8 stories?
No, it's not. The 6 stories is the maximum you can get. So what they anticipate is in case you have a roof over your building or you have plants, in other words, air conditioning and those sort of things. So it is capped at 6 stories.
Even with affordable housing?
I'll come back to that in a minute.
You can't get away with mansards either to get the extra story.
The one thing that the new controls also do is that they switch off a number of other planning controls that apply to this R3 zone currently. So if you're in the Woollahra council area, you can only do a block of flats if your minimum allotment size, your block of land, is 700 square metres or more. That is now switched off. So if you've got a site that is 400 square metres or 500 square metres, and it's in this R3 zone within 400, you can still do your 6 stories and your 2.2 to 1, okay? Now, there is also another category from 400 to 800 metres, all right? So if you're in the outer ring, so to speak, you can have an uplift up to 4 stories. So from 3 stories to 4 stories and a height of 17.5 metres. Once again, you can't sneak in your 5th.
Not that I would want.
and your floor space ratio is 1.5 to 1. So once again, back to the example with 1,000 square metres, you get 1,500 square metres, whereas previously you might have got 1,000 or less than 1,000. As Rick indicated, there is an additional bonus that you can get if you sought to provide affordable housing. Now, there is an affordable housing provision in the current controls, and that's been around for the last couple of years, and that gives you an additional 30% of height and FSR on the basis that you provide 15% affordable housing for a period of 15 years. In other words, for the inner ring of your R3 zone, your 6 stories can go up to 8 stories, and your FSR can go up proportionally as well. In your 4-story zone, in your outer ring, your 4 stories can go up to 5 stories. Okay?
George, just in case there's a misconception with affordable housing versus housing commission, are you able to just briefly explain what affordable housing is?
Affordable housing doesn't mean, well, in these areas, doesn't mean affordable. Nothing ever is. It is a percentage below the median rental. Okay, so it would still be, if the median rental for a 3-bedroom apartment in Woollahra is $1,500 a week, it could be that affordable housing is $1,200 a week. So it is more affordable for someone living in Woollahra. It won't be affordable for someone living in Penrith, for example. Okay.
Does it only apply to R3 zoning or R2 as well?
It's for the R3 zoning only. And happy to, by the way, happy to answer any questions, but it's probably better to group them after the presentation, if that's okay. Now, the other question is, how do you measure the distance? How do you know whether you're in the 400 or the 800? That's a big question, because you'd hate to be one property away and you've got a 6-story building next to you and you're left with your single-story house. So the way you measure it is not a straight line. It's not as the crow flies. It's actually a walking distance. It's a safe and legal walking distance. In other words, you've got to go into a mapping system and you need to draw a line and work out a path of travel that a pedestrian would take that would be 400 or 800 metres.
We are selling tonight discounted measuring wheels by the way.
So we have a number of those measuring wheels, and we normally triple check. So we do the 2 checks with the maps, and then we do 1 check with the measuring wheel as well to confirm, because as I said, if you're just next to the centre, it's obvious that you're in it, within the 400. But if you're line ball, it's something that you would need to pursue and confirm. You can also get a surveyor to do that a lot more accurately if you are on that cusp. Now, what elements do not apply to the LMRs? There are a number of properties that don't, and those are heritage items. So if you're a heritage item, notwithstanding what zoning you're in, notwithstanding how close you are, you're automatically excluded. So you cannot do this on a heritage item. You can, however, do this in a conservation area. Now, there is a difference between a conservation area and a heritage item. A heritage item is if your site is individually listed. A conservation area is the whole area. So, for example, Transvaal Avenue, if you know down the road here, that is a little conservation area comprising the street and either side of the street. Paddington and Woollahra, both of those suburbs in their entirety are conservation areas. So those areas can be included, but as I said, heritage items cannot.
So effectively, Transvaal Avenue could become 6 to 8 stories.
It could, and I'm happy to elaborate on that, and I probably will need to, because there are some limitations as to what might be possible, whether you can demolish what might be referred to as a contributory building in a conservation area. So whilst you have conservation areas, which, as I said, are the group, there are buildings within those conservation areas that are not heritage listed, but are significant, have some level of significance. And if they do have that level of significance, there may well be some reluctance by the councils or indeed the courts to have those demolished. And again, I can elaborate on that at question time. What is also likely to happen, the councils, for example, particularly the inner city councils, have opposed these changes. They didn't want these to happen, and particularly in some areas like Double Bay, Edgecliff, Mossman, some of those areas. So one would expect that the councils would be initially somewhat reluctant to support these. So we're expecting that the majority of our applications would probably automatically go to the court for determination until it all sort of settles down, and then it might be something that's approved by the councils.
George, can I interrupt?
Of course.
I'm hearing from some of the developers that if they group properties to a certain value, they might be able to, or maybe this is a question for John, I'm not sure, they might be able to bypass.
Yes, there is a mechanism to bypass. So if you've got a capital investment value of more than 75 million and or providing more than 40 dwellings, you could bypass that and you could go straight to the state government for what's called a state significant development.
More than 40 or less than 40?
More than 40.
More than 40.
Yeah. Now, so other areas that are excluded are flood-prone areas. So initially the flood-prone areas in the initial discussion papers were excluded. Once this document came out and was gazetted by the minister, they excluded only the country floodplain areas. In other words, Double Bay, which is generally flood-prone, we're all been here when it's raining, is still included, notwithstanding the flood affectation of it. The other thing that's excluded are areas under a flight path. And there is a contour map that indicates what is allowed affectation under the flight path. So anything over a 20 dBA contour is excluded. Most of those eastern suburbs councils are not affected by that. Most of the city councils are not. That mainly applies to the inner west council areas. As I indicated earlier, despite the fact that a commercial centre is the nucleus of these, the commercial centre itself is not applicable in these. So, where we're standing now is a site which has a height limit of 4 stories and a floor space ratio of 2.5 to 1. Whilst if you're outside the zone, you can get 6 stories. Here you're still retaining a height limit of 4 stories, which creates a bit of a hierarchical anomaly, because normally the centres should be seen as a higher scale and the residential areas a bit lower. So as to how the councils or the state government will react to that is something that we're going to wait and see how that goes. The other thing is, how do some other controls that are state government provided apply to these development applications? Now, these development applications that will be submitted are submitted with the council. They're not submitted with the Department of Planning unless you have that example that Rick suggested. So you're submitting with the council as you are with any other DA, and if you get a refusal, you can go to the court as you can with any other DA. There is a publication called the ADG, the Apartment Design Guide, and that's something that when you're designing residential flat buildings, apartment buildings, and you've seen many of those by Mr. Meissen all over the place, they need to conform with those particular guidelines. Now, they suggest great separation distances from the adjoining buildings, greater than the setbacks that you have at the councils at the moment, right? So a lot of people come up to me and say, well, how will you apply that to small sites? Because small sites, let's assume you have a small site of 15 metres wide. If you have to provide 6 metre separations or 12 metre separations, you basically won't get any development in those particular sites. The Department of Planning has thought about that and is anticipating to change the ADG in order to allow some flexibility for that, because they've intentionally, as I said, switched off the minimum allotment sizes and the minimum allotment widths. So there will be some, and again, this hasn't been tested in the courts, but I think there will be some flexibility provided by the councils and the courts in respect of that. The other issue is, what's going to happen if I am within the 400 metre zone, I'm in an R3, I'll put my 6 stories up as a DA. and I overshadow someone, or I lose their view. In other words, what happens if I have an impact as a result of those additional 3 stories? It's a question that no one has been able to answer accurately or categorically, because, as I said, it hasn't been tested by the courts yet. There are 2 ways to look at it. The first way is to say, well, if there is an impact, what the consent authority, the councils or the courts, they can actually ask you to see what you can do in order to try and give some of that solar access or views back. Now, if that means sculpting your building to reduce its upper levels, increase your setbacks by a metre or something like that, I think that's something that would be possible. If, however, it will require you to remove those 3 stories, then the question arises as to, if that was to be the case with every site, how does these new reforms work? They don't work, and the government cannot deliver the promised 112,000 dwellings within 5 years that they have. So it's going to be something that, as I said, will be tested in the courts. In my opinion, in my preliminary opinion, I think that there will be some weight, some considerable weight placed on these 6-storey controls and 4-storey controls.
And George, just from a light perspective, I'm hearing 2 hours, 3 hours. Is there a minimum, or Brian, from the point of view of what is the minimum?
It depends on the council. So some councils have Raine Council has a range of 8 a.m. to 4 p.m, 3 hours. Woollahra Council has 3 hours for the neighbours, that is. The ADG says 2 hours. And again, as I said, it might be that if you have a property that is being developed on the northern side of an adjoining property, no matter what hours there are, all of their solar access will be obliterated because you're dealing with 3 additional stories. So, and as I said, that will be the dilemma for the consent authorities, because if that is the case, and that would be the case with many applications, if they were to take a draconian approach and refuse those applications, the whole reform system does not work. The next thing I wanted to discuss is, how do you submit these? I foreshadowed earlier that you will submit a development application with the councils, but how do you do that? Now, if you have a single house or an existing block of flats, what you can do is lodge a straight out development application with your 6 stories or your 8 stories or your 4 stories. That's quite simple. If you have a development application that you've just had approved for a 3-storey residential flat building, what you can do is submit a development application that adds the 3 stories, and it's just for the 3 additional stories. In other words, it's an application to alter your approval. It's very similar to what was previously referred to as, a Section 455 modification. In other words, a modification of the development application. And the reason why you wouldn't go down that path is because it wouldn't be substantially the same, and it couldn't be categorised or at least assessed under that provision. So for that reason, you're submitting a DA just for the additional stories. I think that's all I have for the moment.
I'll just ask a question
Yes.
of a gentleman when he arrived, because he was asking 22 metres ground, natural ground. What is determined natural ground if you're elevated?
Okay, so it's existing ground level. So there's 2 types of ground. There's natural ground and existing ground. Existing ground level is measured, let's say if you've got an existing house or an existing block of flats on a site, if you have a giant hand and you pick up that dwelling and you take it out, whatever's left in the landform is your existing ground, and you project that up by 22 metres, and that is your height limit. Now, if you have a basement, that basement becomes your existing ground level, okay? So that's somewhat anomalous, but that has been the situation for many, many years. There is an argument to saying there's a number of court judgments and court planning principles that indicate that in such circumstances where you have a basement, that you can reasonably take the natural ground line rather than the existing. So you still need to go through the mechanisms as if it didn't comply, but that would be your number one argument.
So if you had a house or a property or a building and it was elevated, you had 110 steps to get to it, and it was 10 metres above, Is the natural ground here once that house is removed, or is it here from the street?
So it's at any part of that particular
Any
site.
part.
So if you have a natural ground that has one level down here, another one level up there, you just project that up 22 metres, and that is your height limit. So at this point, it's over here.
Right.
Yeah. I'm Greek, by the way, that's why I use my hands a lot.
Just a quick question around compliant development. So currently we've got the low-rise housing and obesity code. You can do CDC compliant development, dullops and terraces and manor houses in R2 and R3s. If you've got a site in an LMR area, can you use that development pathway, the CDC, or do you have to go through the DA to get the consent authority to approve an LMR application?
You still got to go through the DA because they're subject to the additional provisions.
Young lady here.
How do you define a commercial centre?
Okay, so there are two types. One is a railway station, and the other is a commercial centre that is identified in the development in a mapping situation in the SEP in this publication. So initially, the Department of Planning identified them where they had a supermarket greater than 2,000 square metres. Okay, and it identified those as centres. So there's 4 in the eastern suburbs, or at least this part of the eastern suburbs, being Double Bay. Double Bay doesn't have a station, but it is at the centre. Rose Bay, same situation. Edgecliff and Bondi Junction, and then you've got Randwick, etc. So these are contained. There's a map contained in the publication. It's called the. No, it's the housing SEP. I'm sorry, it's the housing SEP, and this is chapter 6 of the housing SEP. There is a schedule in there that has the maps.
And that actually defines the outline of the commercial centre.
What it does,
So you can pick your 4 items
That-
from that.
That's right, and it normally aligns with the outline of the commercial centre zoning. So if you go into the zoning map in the council, and I'll just grab one of those. So this is Double Bay, this is the Bay, this is Double Bay Centre, okay? This is New South Head Road. As you can see, this is the blue bit is the commercial centre. The light pink is the R2 zone, in other words, your houses zone. The darker pink is the R3 zone. So if this is the centre, if I'm situated here, which might be Court Road, you're within the 400, you're in an R3 zone, you can do 6 stories. If I'm here, which is, this is what happens when you get old. If I'm here, which is Balcara Road, for example, or Fairfax Road, the other side of Fairfax Road, it's an R2 zone, and you'd be able to do your 0.8 to 1 and your residential flat building of 3 stories. Okay? This centre here is Edgecliff, and so on. Rose Bay is over here, and it's the same scenario. Now, if you go into the Department of Planning website, you will also find a link, and that link shows you the centres as well as the areas that are mapped around as an approximate area, and that is only the 800. It doesn't differentiate between 400 and 800. It's only the 800, and as I said, that is indicative. You still need to go and double check whether you're within that or not.
For those who have registered tonight, we will be sending out those maps out. A question that was just asked, 400 metres from the outskirts? Or?
Yes, so this is the map that's contained in the Department of Planning website. So this is Double Bay, as I said. This is New South Head Road through the middle. Sorry, this way. That's the bay. This is the outline of that blue area that I showed you before, and coincidentally it's blue again. And as you can see, all these areas are the 800 zone. There isn't a differentiation for the 400 yet.
Just a question
Yes.
really is,
Yes,
from the boundary of the commercial to what?
it's from the boundary of the commercial to the nearest point
On your property?
on your property. It doesn't, so if only 3% of your property is within that 800 or 400, you're okay. Yes?
So in some areas they've identified metros and train stations, and the definition in the housing set is to the entrance of a metro or a train. But sometimes you get these big, large parcels of land where the government owns, so let's say a metro where there's nice greenery on top, but the entrance is located on one side of that property. So what's the definition of the entrance?
That's a grey area still, right? So, and there was a question also as to whether it's from the turnstiles or the entry, etc. So again, that hasn't been identified yet as a final solution in terms of what is the actual point. With most of the centres, it's quite easy, but there are some of those anomalies that you identified.
Nick, I think you have a question. Sorry, but just going back to the R2 zone and places, you said the minimum now is 50. Is that a blanket across all LGAs now, or is that just still applied close to the town centres? So in Woollahra, for example, if I'm not 800 metres to the town centre,
It is a blanket, and I should double check this, but that came in some time ago, right? And it allowed dual occupancies in all zones. This just gives you the greater FSR subject to, but as I understand, and I stand to be corrected, it does apply to all areas. And generally speaking, Woollahra currently has a minimum allotment size of 460 anyway. Waverley has a minimum 450. So it's quite aligned with the controls anyway.
In your discussion, when you were discussing affordable housing, did I hear you mention 15 years?
Yes, it needs to be kept as affordable housing for 15 years, and that's got to be managed by a housing provider.
And then what?
And then it goes to, you can sell them, you can do whatever you want with them.
It's not owned by council, it's just the restrictions apply for 15 years. The council doesn't have ownership.
That's absolutely right, yes. It's still under the applicant's ownership.
Harry, do you have a question?
Can you use any of these controls to increase floor space on single residential dwellings
No.
in the areas?
No, you can't, unfortunately. So in order to do that, the minimum is a duplex, a dual occupancy. So it does not apply to single dwellings, unfortunately. Yes?
George, with this, the 400 or 800 metres to the boundary, and you said it's got to be walking distance, it can't be as a profile, so can this walking distance be using laneways and things like that?
It's got to be, it could be even pathways. So you know how you've got a pathway, say in Carlotta Road, you've got a pathway that leads from the bottom up to the top.
Yep.
If it's a legal pathway, it doesn't matter if it's steps, it doesn't have to be an accessible pathway, it just needs to be a legal and safe pathway. When I say safe, if you're looking at arterial roads, main roads, it needs to include a crossing, okay? Yep. So if you've got a crossing on New South Head Road, you need to utilise that pedestrian crossing. You can't take a shortcut.
That's very
Yeah.
Would you mind repeating that? Because I think that's very relevant when some of us are drawing up the 400 metres versus the 800 metres.
So it talks about a safe and legal walking distance. And I'll take your question in a moment if I may.
To be clear, it's at any point on the perimeter?
Correct.
You don't go to like a post office or a specific point in the town centre?
No, it's the actual town centre.
So to any point on the boundaries? Yeah.
Correct. So if you're living in Guilfoyle Avenue, this would be the obvious closest one, etc. So as I indicated earlier, it's a safe and legal distance. Safe being you need to be able to find a crossing that is safe, pedestrian crossing, or lights if you're on a main road. And it's got to be a legal access. So it could be a pathway. It can't be through someone's driveway, for example. Okay?
Because the lady on the right is...
We're going to jump the queue, but we're going to come back to it.
I was going to say, if it's a laneway, there's no footpath, is that still...
That would be problematic. So if it's a laneway, it needs to have a footpath. And again, what constitutes a footpath? Because if it's 300 wide, it's normally a curb, it's not a footpath. It probably has to be a normal footpath. I'm sorry?
Flight paths.
Oh, yes. So there is a
Can you just keep it down a little bit? Thank you, sorry.
There is a publication called the Sydney Airport Master Plan 2013. Don't ask me where I got it, my staff got it for me. And it includes that map. Now, I don't know how well you can see that, but it's got one line going this way and another series of lines going that way. They are contours. The closer you get to the runways, the higher the decibels, the higher the noise affectation. So if you're over 20 dBA or the 20 ANEF, which is this dotted line, the outer dotted line, you would be excluded from that area.
Oh, the question was in relation specifically to the flying boat Catalina's.
Why do you want to complicate my life? That hasn't been identified. It's not about that. It's actually about the noise that the aeroplanes would have on the dwellings. What the department doesn't want to do is have additional accommodation where it's very noisy. So the Rose Bay flying planes, most planes fly, seaplanes, that flight path does not apply.
Because of noise to residents.
What parking provisions are off-street parking?
They normally revert to the council planning controls. Initially, they were dealing with they were going to have a minimum of 0.5 spaces for the residential flat buildings. That's come off for the residential flat buildings, and it reverts back to the council's planning controls. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to know, what is the time frame for all this development to take place? What are we talking about?
It can take place from as of 3 weeks ago, when this was gazetted.
That's when the talk began.
No, that's when the document was gazetted.
Fair enough.
Okay.
From that point onwards, how long does it take for that 6-story building to be built?
Okay, so there are a number of architects here, and
So
that.
the question is, how long would it take for some of this development to possibly take place? So part of that answer is it's already been gazetted, it's law. Now it's going to be a question of how long it's going to take to get a DA through.
So there is preparation.
3 to 4, no, maybe 9 to 12 months.
9 to 12 months for DA, possibly.
To get the DA?
So
That's before you...
there's probably a couple of months to prepare the DA,
Right.
and then the council or the court will take, as Brian said, 6 to 12 months to determine that DA. So you could be seeing something starting to build in 18 months or something.
18 months?
Yeah.
I just want to know if I'm going to live long enough.
George,
Yes.
Yeah, so basically, with this code,
Yes.
it's basically replacing the council's codes. So you still need to lodge a DA. You're
Yes.
still governed by the ADG and overshadowing and everything like that.
Yes.
So it's really the same thing. So you've got to go through council and work with them and fight with them, and that's why it's going to take the same sort of time as it does now.
What it does is
Replacing their codes.
it'll take longer because most councils will be flooded with DAs.
That's right.
They're under-resourced at the moment, so that's and that's what's going to lead to a lot of them going to the courts,
Back to court.
and the court system is still is clogged up at the moment. Now, what it does though is it provides two controls: a height and an FSR. And if you comply with that height and FSR that is provided to you, for example, your 6 stories and your
But like current codes, you might not be able to achieve that.
no, that's a maximum. So if you comply with those,
Yeah.
then the council cannot legally refuse the application
Correct.
on the basis of those two controls.
Yeah.
They can, however, if they wanted to, refuse it on the basis of an impact
Correct.
that they
So
might
it's the
have.
same sort of thing.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, and sorry, just touching on that gentleman's question before, if you're within that 400 to 800 metre zone, does that stop you now from doing the current CDC sort of stuff?
No,
You can still do it?
yes.
Thank you.
Questions, anyone?
Yes.
Yes.
How many allowances been made for the roads?
Allowances for roads.
We're increasing.
Infrastructure.
Infrastructure.
So the infrastructure,
Are there any new roads?
no, there's no proposals for any changes to the infrastructure. So that's probably one outcome that is something that, depending on how many applications do get approved, how many buildings do get built in our concentrated area, and what the impact of those will be. Normally, residential traffic demand, or at least traffic generation, is the lowest traffic generation category when you compare it to others. So, as much as you may say, oh, all of these additional units is going to create chaos, it normally settles down. I know.
What about
No, well, they can't do anything. They can't increase. They can't widen the road. All they can do is, I'm sorry, all they can do is increase the public transport. But in terms of some of the road topology, particularly in some of these areas, it's quite constrained.
Question, gentlemen.
I'm full of questions today. So you referenced the ADG, the Apartment Design Guide. What happens if the council already has existing DCP, so design control plans for residential flat buildings, where they've already predetermined setbacks and so forth, and the character and the density that they want in the area, based on an old DCP or an existing DCP? How's then this come into place in the LMR? So do you then work up a blend of both, the ADG and the DCP?
You start off with the DCP, because the DCP has normally the minimum requirements. The ADG's got a greater separation distance. So with Willara, for example, the controls could be a minimum of 1 metre, 1.5 metres, depending on your site width, up to probably 3.5 metres. The ADG is going to be greater, okay, with most cases. The rear setback is 25% of your site length versus 6 metres under the ADG. So once again, the DCP is less onerous. What I would suggest is that if you are submitting a development application, you need to look at trying to comply as much as you can with the DCP. And that provides any number of other controls, because they're all opportunities for the council to say no.
Wayne?
You mentioned that there was a bypass on 40 minimum dwelling. Is that the only bypass?
$75 million.
Is that construction or total project?
Construction.
Construction.
All right.
Construction, 75 million and a minimum of 40 dwellings.
That's right.
They are the only two.
Yes. Listen, there are a whole array of other requirements. They're contained in the SEP as well. Happy to go through those, but it's quite convoluted. But they're the two key ones.
Thank you.
Young lady?
I'm just wondering about the adverse effect on property values now, because preparing a contract for sale,
Yes.
applying for certificates or whatever you go to, these are all going to show up now as affectations or advantages. I wonder what percentage is going to still affect the sale price.
That's him.
I think there are many things happening in the, I'm just going to say community or communities for now. We have got clients that feel they've hit the jackpot and they've got gold. And then we've got other clients that have got fool's gold. And I'll elaborate. We recently put a development site, a couple of developments, major development sites together. X amount of houses. Some clients got double what they would have got on the open market. Admittedly, they got double, but there's also terms involved. Let's not walk out of here today and go, I'm worth double and I'm going to settle in 6 weeks. The developers are still taking risk. I'm not pro one or the other, but they're still taking risk. They still need to fund. And developers are going, I've got all these sites to choose from, not just in Double Bay or Bondi or Darling Point or Bondi Junction or Maroubra or Randwick. So I think, my personal view is that from a development point of view, I think we're going to see a pullback in per square metre rates, in my opinion. Because what are they going to be worth in 2 and 3 years' time?
Just putting it out there. A young family that joined one of the groups recently, so we put X amount of homes together. People next door contacted Alex and I and said, look, we've just heard about the rezoning, come and see us because we want to amalgamate with next door and have a development site. We've gone, well, actually, it's funny, you should be ringing us because we've actually just sold next door and the others up the road. Oh, we want to be involved. That particular developer said, oh, I don't know because it might be too big on bulk for overshadowing, etc., etc. The first 6 got X amount, the next 6 got less. Still quite a substantial price above market, but less. Another scenario, development site, 1 house left. I'm told by this developer that he or she or that company needs to make an offer to that standing alone person. And if they reject it, then this maybe is a question for John. If they reject it, then he's fulfilled his duties. So what has had that particular, and I'm not painting a bad impression of developers here, but they're making a commercial decision. Instead of that property that was on the market, could have been on the market 2 months ago, being worth 7 million, they've offered them 5 million. The reality is there's 3 development sites in that local pocket, if not in that street. I say to that client, I don't know what your property's worth today. So there are winners and losers. Anything you'd like to add to that, John? Yeah, you when you talk, sorry. So property values, another client rang me recently. He's just outside the 800 metres. So he wants to get maybe John or a solicitor together to say, I want to lobby, I'm 25 metres out. How do I get included? There's so much going on. So much going on. So there's winners and some losers. If I can use those terms loosely, another client that came in on that other site that we just sold recently, they've just spent $2.2 million refurbishing their home. They love their house, they're happy. But they've also gone, I don't want to possibly be next to 6 or 8 stories. So there's a lot of, depending on your life, your stage of life, and what you're doing, as I said, there's some winners and some people that aren't better off. Sorry.
Yeah, just a question, Vic, on the single house next to the development site example that you just quoted. Wouldn't the developer have to be fair and reasonable and also be cognizant of the precedent of what the other properties would offer?
I don't know the legal answer to that, and maybe John, that's a question that you might be able to answer in a moment. What I was told by this particular developer was, that's the only one that's left. I need to fulfill my criteria and make them an offer. And if it's rejected, then I've ticked my box. But John, could you elaborate on that? Okay. Yeah, right, okay. So maybe, John, why don't we switch over to George? Was there anything else you wanted to add for the moment? I know we're going a little bit over time.
Sorry, one question. Yes. You've got quite a good sized development site, not in many of these zones, but you are, on either side of you do have buildings that are up to 10 metres, despite floor level height restriction. Can you see council being a little bit more flexible with these ones outside these zones with regards to height? To create more residential?
The objective will not be to create more residential.
Yep.
You'll have to go through the rigorous tests of a non-complying development, which is what's called a clause 4.6 variation, which has got a lot of jurisdictional hurdles to go through. Now, I think there would be a reasonable argument if you could contextually fit within those parameters. You'll need to establish, it's a much more onerous test of impacts. Any impact resulting from the non-compliance will not be tolerated. That's going to be the biggest test.
So you don't think they'll be more flexible with that at all?
No, they won't be more flexible, but if you can demonstrate that there are no impacts, because you might have the top level set in, or whatever else, that might have an opportunity. Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Well, we all know a lot about the planning scheme and how it works. George has very eloquently described that in a considerable amount of detail, and his knowledge is extensive in that area. I worked with him quite a long time, from when I was originally on Woollahra Council from 1995 through to 2008. and also before I became mayor in 2001 to 2004. And we worked a lot on DAs, and I was on the Urban Planning and Development Control Committee, so we had a lot of interaction. So probably not learned as much as George knows, because he works with it every day. And when I was on council, I was working with it every week. So I know how intricate it's been, and just as George has covered it, but some of you who live in Woollahra would be aware that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, developers suddenly realised that residential 2B zones in the middle. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I'll speak up. Yeah. Developers suddenly realised that 2B zones, residential, allowed extra development. So all of a sudden there was a mad rush, and I saw it as a councillor sitting on the Development Control Committee of DAs in Rose Bay, Darling Point at that time, and Bellevue Hill. And the problem that arose from that is we suddenly had to start working on our controls, because you had 15-metre frontages with 3-storey walk-up blocks of flats where you can imagine shoehorning and all this sort of thing, the sort of density and problems that are associated with that. So we then said you had to have a minimum 25-metre frontage, which meant consolidation of sites, and that started to bring some level of control to the situation. Although that's when a lot of developments got done in that period of time. So this is the second wave effect, if I think would be the best way to call it, wouldn't it, George, that is happening under this control.
John, can I interrupt your thoughts?
Yes.
Your plan of thought. We spoke recently, and I've voiced a couple of concerns that I'm hearing from the community, and you actually said that this is actually, there's been a lot more research done when a couple of years ago, I think, before this has all been implemented. So it's not a fly-by-night thing in terms of the...
No, well, look, anybody who's read the newspapers or listened to the news, and digital or otherwise, will be aware that this has been talked about for a long time by government. But look, there's a lot more to it being... I don't think it has been planned that deeply for a long period of time.
Yeah.
I think what it is, from just following media and all sorts of other things, it's a reaction to the immigration, because all of a sudden we had huge numbers of people coming in under the current administration, and they had to provide more housing in Sydney, because a lot of people want to live in Sydney, being the most populated city, and the New South Wales being the most populated state in the country. And so that was part of it. The other part was that the government then, and it was coming from federal and state, and the question was, we've got to have more housing, we've got to have more housing. So they said, how are we going to do this? And the other part, which Premier Minns has had to deal with, is the issue of DA processes and length of time. Woollahra's probably down the bottom of the list as far as length of time, but you've got inner western, outer western suburbs that are taking a year, 18 months longer. And so there are actually councils have been talking, government has been talking about waving the big stick. And the meaning of the big stick is taking away planning powers from councils entirely, where they don't meet targets. And just jumping one step ahead with this new LMR housing policy and development zones, I suspect, it wasn't, isn't the position now, but I suspect that we may get the federal government or the state government, probably the state government more likely, stepping in, just like when Bondi Junction, the two parts, Woollahra had the northern side of Oxford Street, Waverley had the southern side of Oxford Street, when Ernie Page, who was the Minister for Local Government at the time, decided to amalgamate Bondi Junction as a composite zone within one council, and I was involved on the joint planning committee between the two councils at the time when that happened. So the boundary was then moved to the Sid Hindfeld Drive. And so then what happened is that following on from that, the joint plan that the two councils had for the Waverley-Woollahra area for that part, in the residential surrounding the immediate CBD of Bondi Junction, was to have some controls in a new development control plan. Waverley Council prepared it because it was the custodian of the composite new area. And what happened then is that the state government said, no, we're not satisfied with the density. We want higher heights, we want more density and all the rest of it. So the area of Bondi Junction, for argument's sake, bounded by Everleigh Street on the south, Grafton Street on the north, I think it's Bronte Road on the east, and Denison Road, I think it is, on the west, suddenly had and you can see them building to the sky. Now, I think that what may happen, and it's my personal opinion, but again following trends that I read and hear about in the media, is that the state government may, if there's delays, if there's issues, step in and override the councils entirely. And so it's not only the FSR and height controls, but it may actually turn around and say, we're going to take over the approval of the developments in this area if we don't feel it's meeting our housing provision guidelines. So that's my personal view. It may turn out to be true. All the indicators in my mind are that there'll be pressure there. And that, if I might sort of directing me away from my talk a bit, but I think infrastructure was raised, so that's another issue that flows from that road. So I think a lady mentioned we already are constrained.
That's an interesting point that John just raised. And in layman terms, it's a case of what we said earlier. What if councils decide that every DA will be refused because of loss of use, solar access, conservation areas, whatever, and continually refuse? What John just said is quite interesting. What's the department going to do? The department's going to say, well, we provided this means to try and get these additional houses, and the councils are not doing the right thing. And for that reason, as John indicated, they could lose their powers in respect of these particular DAs. So that's a very, very good point.
Thanks, George. Okay.
John, just in relation to the single dwelling standalone, are you aware of legislation or a process that has to follow? Or were you aware that they simply need to make an offer? I don't know.
You're talking about people who want to join with adjoining people, or just one person with one property?
One person's been left out.
Isolated.
It's isolated, and they'll have to do a DA on their own. But I don't think they'll be able to use the benefit because they won't have enough land size.
But is there, to the best of your knowledge, a process where that the developer needs to meet?
Yeah, I can answer that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what would that look like?
Well, I can cover that. It's in my talk.
Okay,
so
we'll come back.
I went by way of background, but I think we need to get into the talk proper. Okay, so I'm in Bondi Junction. I've been a solicitor for 50 years, so I've had a lot of experience in property, and I'm a solicitor in Bondi Junction, and I've been practicing for 50 years, and I'm an accredited specialist in property law, so I think I pretty well know what I'm talking about in the property field. So I actually also represent, as Rick knows, a number of property owners, and I'll be touching on the two angles of property that we're talking about, strata titles and individual homes, because they are people who are seeking advice in relation to this new policy and how it affects them. So I'll start off about houses, and then I'll go on to strata units later. And because there's before this new policy, there was already, I think, under the Strata Schemes Management Act, the strata renewal process, which was to update or replace old and worn-out buildings or whatever, and build a new building. So, with individual homes, I've had approaches from a number of people who have either combined 3 to 4 homes or more in different parts of the municipality, Rose Bay, Paddington, and when I say Paddington, fringing on Double Bay, and in Double Bay. So the question that arises from all of this is the process of the making of offers, and they've come through, I don't know your experience because you've been involved in putting people together, but some may be approached by developers. More likely it's through agents. Okay, and I know, for instance, Collier's is one that
should always be through an agent, of course.
Yes. Okay, here's the plug. But I was going to say Collier's is another one that I know in the municipality is working quite heavily in Belvia Hill. And so the idea is that, what my role or what a solicitor's role is in this whole process is not only to see the documents, and I'll come to what those documents are in a moment, because they vary from a home to a unit, and also unravel the complexity and get involved to the extent that is necessary in negotiations as between a developer, their agent, and the homeowner, unit owner, so that there's a fair outcome. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll take you through the legal processes and obligations you may encounter if you're approached. Some of you may have already been approached by the developer or agent on their behalf, and you may choose to combine, as I said, with others, or go it alone, or if you're you're the last person in a block of units that's being pressed to join the group. So, houses on individual titles. what happens there? Interested owners might be approached individually or engage with their neighbours. And like I said, there's cases of 3 to 4 houses in Carlotta Road, Double Bay, for instance, is one. Another group in Spencer Street, Rose Bay, and another group in Carlisle Street, Rose Bay, which I'm currently dealing with. So all of those are in the LMR. The question then is the negotiation with the interested developer so as to take advantage by the property owner of the property law changes, and obviously the interest in the developer to make a bigger site, be able to develop under the new controls. So, firstly, agreement on price and terms. And usually what happens is there's a document called a Heads of Agreement. I've seen one that's 1 page, I've seen another one that's 20 pages. And it depends how detailed the discussions have been. It might cover things like price, it might cover things like what's going to be in the contract that follows, and you know, how long, what deposit's going to be paid and so forth. I'll go into that in a bit more detail as we go along. The Heads of Agreement is usually prepared by the developer's lawyer and provided to you. And I've seen them when people come to me because it's already been done that way. And then the owners have to, what happens, the developer usually wants to put a fixed price on the combined number of properties or the combined units. What I've found in practice is they're reluctant to split it into the individual units or the individual properties. I have been successful in negotiating an individual offer to each of the unit owners, for instance in Bilby Hill recently, where a developer gave a fixed price for the whole block of units. But the problem with that is, how do you divide the money? I'll give you a lump sum figure. How do you divide that between the unit owners or the group of 3 or 4 houses? All the houses might be on the same land size. Some houses have a bigger frontage or a bigger depth, or they have a view. So all of those things, you know, just using the adage of agents selling, position. So those are the sort of things that a developer will look at to say, okay, or even an owner to try and work out, well, mine's worth more than the other one, you know, down the bottom or over there or whatever. So this highlights some of the issues that I've come across in practice, okay, already. So the next thing is the developer will work out his figures based on the document or a piece of paper. It might be the back of a postage stamp at times, and that's not an attack on developers, but I've seen it. A feasibility study. And what that document does is they factor in the acquisition costs of the land on a per square metre basis. That's how they calculate the figure. It could be tens of thousands per square metre, it could be you know, higher or lower than that. But finance and holding costs, building costs per square metre, likely realisation at time of sale per square metre, and the composite of all of those to work out what is going to end up being the end result. The builder will look at it from the construction and all those headings that I just gave you. But recently in the press, there was an article from the Property Council, or a senior person from the Property Council of Australia, that says they carried out a study, and on average, state government's taxes, lodgement fees and processing is 40% of the cost of development and construction. That's a hell of a whack. So it's not all the developers' costs, it's also the government costs at various levels. And anyway, that will also affect the developer working out what's my profitability at the end of the project, how much can I reasonably afford to make a profit, and also give the owners a uplift in the current market value, and that's the other thing I want to talk about. So there'll be negotiations about that, you know, up or down, as between usually through the agent, whoever it is, and the property owners or the group of property owners or the strata group, if it's a strata building, to try and get the prices worked out. As I said, if it's a composite price, the difficulty is splitting it up and seeing whether you can get individual prices. But again, that's a negotiation process. The developers clearly want to make a profit. It's part and parcel of business. So that's a hard yakka, but the thing is, at the end of the day, that's probably where solicitors, people like me and people like Rick and other agents that get involved will either have a joint or almost a mediated style of negotiation to get an outcome. I think everybody's going to want an outcome, but the reality, and I found this on a couple of the sites, is where people are being offered a very low uplift on the current market value of their property, and they've done their homework and all the rest of it, and then they say, well, hang on a minute, you know, when they build this thing and whatever, and it's going to be worth so much more and all the rest of it. I mean, for instance, William Street, Double Bay, you know, house, I think a penthouse on the northern side, sold for 20 million. Now, the land was probably bought originally, I don't know, maybe that building's finished 3, 4, 5 years ago, and it probably was bought for about something like about 5 million. So that gives you an example. You know, people might say, oh, 5 million, now 20 million, no, for just one penthouse and whatever, and add all the other ones together, oh, there's got to be a lot of money in the barrel or whatever. Surely they can offer me more. I know, yeah, you know exactly what's going on, so I know how it works. That's why I gave all that background of government costs and everything else. So the what happens then is that, again, in units, just like with land, size of apartment views and other factors, for instance, some of them in Bellevue Hill, they're at a lower level, which is almost basement, and the other ones that are high up, having the views across the harbour, obviously a big differential in value. There's a townhouse development on the fringe of Double Bay, which I'm involved in at the moment, and on that one, the uplifts that have been offered have been between 50% to double. So they're pretty high because it's a townhouse development, because of the size of the land and because of the location. So it's a big range of what's being negotiated and offered because of the various factors I described earlier. So I can't give you any more estimation than that. That would have to be worked out at the time between the agents, the developer, the owners, and the negotiation process. So now I'll move on to the strata process in more detail. What happens there is, oh, sorry, by the way, yeah, no, I'll show you in a minute. The situation with the strata is that again, that you will have the heads of agreement, right, which is a summary of the documents. Now, on a sale by private owners, I didn't touch on that. There will be a contract. There won't be there won't be a put and call option, because that only, in my mind. Sorry, yes, sorry. It's just a bit too far away, and there's all this in the middle that I have to lean over. Okay, that's better. So yeah, with those stratas, what happens is that there will be a heads of agreement followed by a deed of put and call option. Okay, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. With the land sale, it would be the heads of agreement and a contract where the owners sell their land to the developer. Okay, so that's how the main differential I'm seeing from the legal point of view as to the two processes, whether you're a joint landowner or whatever. If you're a joint landowner, the landowners may also want to enter into a private agreement between themselves, which sets out, you know, like what the approximate view of the value of the land are, and how they'll split the money between them when it comes to that. Okay, so getting back to strata, the heads of agreement is a document that, as I said, could be as small as 1 page up to about 10 pages.
John, did you want questions at the end? Or
yeah, at the end, please. So if I show you this one, that is not just the heads of agreement. No, sorry, the heads of agreement isn't separate from this. That is not just the deed of put and call option. It's also the contract, the draft contract, because the rule in the circumstances of an option, put and call option, is where the developer sends out a document. He can then say, okay, I want to exercise that option now. I've got the DA approval or whatever. I'm waiting for Gazette of approval, whether it comes from state or local government. And then I've paid you a deposit, which might be 5% or 10% or whatever. And then you can then take me to the next step where you can keep your deposit, and we'll go through with the rest of the transaction. Now, that raises another issue. In the heads of agreement, what developers do is, some say that the deposit is non-refundable, and that's why they reduce it to 5% instead of 10%. Others say, if they don't get the approval, then the whole deal's off, and I want the deposit I paid you back. They're contractual arrangements that are negotiated in the process. So the reason that's thick is because the contract for a property, in this particular case, it involved a strata plan, had to have all the requirements that anybody here who's bought or sold a property will know. You have a zoning certificate from the council, you have a drainage diagram from the water board and a sewer service diagram, you have certificates of land tax and government foreign investment review, withholding requirements, etc., 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 and title searches. So that is the kind of documentation one can expect if they're in their put and call option process with a strata. Currently in Bellevue Hill, I'm dealing with one where the developers have already got 3 out of 4 blocks, and they've got 6 out of, or they're working with the 6 unit owner out of 8, and that 6 unit owner tips the balance of 3/4 of the unit entitlement. So people who live in units will know that you have a unit entitlement, which is based on the area of your unit compared to the whole, and you own that percentage in the land if the building is ever taken away for some reason, like a flood or an earthquake or whatever. That percentage also works out how much you would get out of the insurance if the building was demolished or whatever and you had to be rebuilt. So that's not the be-all and end-all of what you're entitled to. So what happens there is that when 3/4 of that unit entitlement is reached in acquisition arrangements with the developer, they then have enough to take it to the next stage of the strata renewal process. And that's under, as I say, the Strata Titles Act, and it involves an application to the local Land Registry Services, which is the government office handling titles. And to give you an idea of the process of renewing of stratas, the steps are voting to, firstly there's an approach, voting to opt in the process, initiating a collective sale and renewal process, forming a strata renewal committee, developing a strata renewal plan, considering the plan, and then entering into approval of the plan and contracts. And if a court order is required to get the last quarter of the unit entitlement over the line, then the developer has to go through that process. What I notice is a bit of variation in developers dealing with stratas. In the one I gave, for example, in Bellevue Hill, they've already signed up 3 of the 4 buildings, and they've got 6 of the 8 units after they get my current client signing up, which is about to happen. And there's obviously some negotiating capability there, but within reason, because again the prices uplift is limited for the reasons I said before. So they will probably work on that, and then the other 2 will follow suit and join up, because it's going to be a whole series of 4 buildings demolished. Then what with parking, underground excavation and everything else, another problem in redevelopment, especially in places like Bellevue Hill, which is built on the sand. When that last wave of late 90s, early 2000s happened, what we had to do is run around quickly and sort of have new excavation controls, because what was happening is, and I think it was Banksia Road, I think I mentioned as an example, that links Old South Head Road and Birriga Road. There was an excavation without doing proper contiguous piling. That means without supporting the area around the excavation where the basement was going to be built, because all these properties were up on a hill from the street. There was land collapse, just like there was land collapse in where the stairs are in the back of Cooper Park, and also next to Bryce Courtney, the author's home, again in Bellevue Hill. So they're key issues where we brought in new excavation controls, but they will also become important now with major developments, especially on the R3 area, in relation to the 6 stories, because there'll be a lot more pressure on the land and a lot more excavation going on, which also raises all the other things that I had to deal with when I was on council, which was working out about how to redirect underground water flows. These are issues that developers have to look at when they're pricing a property in the development project and so forth, because they all flow from that kind of development. Again, for the reasons I just gave. Where are we? Okay, the other thing is the process of somebody asked about how long things will take. I think it was a lady who was here earlier. I mean, we went through the DA approval stage. We went through the application part stage and the court if you had to go to court. or the building program, especially with strata buildings, is likely to take anywhere between another 2 to 5 years, depending on the site problems and so forth. So it's a long project. One of the things I notice as a solicitor is that I get requisitions when people are buying properties, or I send them actually, get the answers from the owner. But if I'm acting for the owner and we answer them, the questions that are often asked, now they're being asked more often before exchange of contracts, is in the nature of requisitions or questions which were normally asked after contracts were exchanged. So they want to know, have you had any notice of notification of any building approvals or developments or anything happening in the vicinity? So all of a sudden the councils are now issuing in their certificates, their zoning certificates, details of proximate developments, and because people are worried about that. So that's another thing that can have an effect. I think the lady over there asked about, will it affect house prices? Yes, it will. I mean, land values will increase, but by the same token, other people will say, oh, I don't want to live next to a 6-storey building. So there are all sorts of permutations and combinations, if you want to call it that, of issues that arise. And I've just made a note of several of these sort of things. The one I mentioned in detail earlier, excavation, soil and landslip issues, Belvey Hill for an example, or other steeply sloping sites. Another one, the property sales, which I just mentioned earlier. Roads and infrastructure, which somebody at the back asked. As George said, we're already constrained. Better Buses was a program which many of you might remember, and wasn't better buses. Usually, instead of coming every half hour, 2 came on the hour. And the thing is, it was worse buses, and I remember we said it. And when I was on council, we actually had all 3 transport authorities, the ferries, the buses, the trains, and said, can't you guys get together? Finally, they got back together as Transport for New South Wales. But there's still, I think in business management terms, they call it siloing. They don't work together for the common good and whatever. One thing we did achieve, though, was we had commuter services out of Rose Bay, which never existed. But what we also wanted was the commuter bus service down to the ferry wharf. Bringing in people from Dover Heights to North Rose Bay and all that surrounding area, which would greatly improve the transport system out of the eastern suburbs. Because we all know, especially the ones who live from Belvey Hill, Rose Bay, Vaucluse, Dover Heights and down to Watsons Bay, it's a constant gridlock. Because there's only 2 major routes in, Old South and New South Head roads. So they're the issues. I've given you an overview. I'll take questions now because I've actually picked on things that were asked before, and I've also, I've given you an oversight of what the whole process is on the legal side. Yes. Yes.
It was just a question on the strata.
Of course.
Is it 75% of your building?
Unit entitlement.
Yes.
The unit entitlement means that you could have 3/4 of the units. But if you've got some 2-bedders and 1-bedders, the 2-bedders will have a higher unit entitlement than the 1-bedders. So it's got to be, let's say the unit entitlement is out of 1,000, it's got to be 750.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
Otherwise, and that may be not 3/4 of the number of units. Let's say there's 20 units in the building, 3/4 of that is 15. It may be 18 units to achieve that.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you.
That's how it works. Yes.
George made a really good comment earlier that obviously LMR applications, it's a bit of an uncharted waters at the moment.
That's right.
Council can take 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. So there's a big risk for developers, so putting my developer hat on, to go and acquire a site under an unconditional contract, even with a delayed settlement, with all these unknowns, whether you're going to get the density that you need to make the deal work based on the price you offered from day one. So, based on your experience, where do you sort of advise around option contracts? So, it gives a bit of flex for the developer, where they put a sizable amount down to secure a site with a commitment, obviously based on trying to get a successful application to make it work.
Well, that's why everyone that's involved Strava so far I've seen, they used, probably all options are used as a standard. And the term that's often used is council approved or gazetted. Okay.
What about for individual dwellings?
Individual dwellings at the moment, I haven't seen it, but it may be something that developers will want to use. What I forecast, I won't say definitely predict, but it could come true, as I said, because as I read all the stuff about the pressure on the approval periods and so forth, is that the government will want this to happen and want to make it work. And so that means that they'll probably step in and take over, and particularly where George said, if there's a refusal, and a lot of refusals, and they'll take overriding powers, just like they did to the CBD of Bondi Junction, where they said to Waverley Council, no, forget it. This is, you said up to there, we're saying up to there.
It's interesting when we talk about risk, and I'm not a developer, but dealing with a lot of developers at the moment, and I think a discussion that I had with George briefly, or a comment that was made with, just because they can go 2.2 to 1 and 22 metres, doesn't mean they're going to get 2.2 to 1. They may end up getting, with design and setbacks and overshadowing, it may only be 1.5 to 1. And I only put that out there because when we were talking about gold mines versus fool's gold, a lot of clients at the moment that have been contacting us and going, I believe the per square metre rates are ranging between A and B. We actually want C, and yet we're not negotiable on terms. So there are a lot of discussions at the moment going on, not just on pricing, but also terms and deposits. And it's not a given that just because you can go 22 metres and your floor space ratio of 2.2 to 1 or 1.5 to 1, that effectively that will happen.
Can a house that isn't, because I know there are restrictions in terms of battle axes and things like that, you've got to have the frontage for the new zoning, for example. Can you piggyback with somebody who doesn't qualify for the zoning to combine?
That's a good question.
So
an amalgamation outside.
An amalgamation, so if you have a 13 metre frontage and behind you have somebody who's on a battle axe, but that would provide amazing parking and access.
That could be done through the owners applying for a plan of consolidation and then submitting the combined site.
You could consolidate, but the consolidation alone, in theory, should not give you a pass for the 400 or 800 metres, okay? Because conceivably, if you said, oh, you know what, I'm going to consolidate the whole street, does that mean that the whole street will be now included? So if a site's already been consolidated, let's say prior to the bringing in of this document, then it's okay. But in my view, I don't think you can add an additional site by consolidation, and by adding that particular site, you get the benefit for the other one.
So you won't be able to do that?
That's my preliminary view.
Not at the moment. But what might happen is that, as they see this panning out, as we said, a lot of unknowns, the government, basically it was knee-jerk. They threw it out there, and there's a lot of detail that hasn't been decided yet.
It's normal.
And
we had COVID. We're doing this. The detail.
And so what will happen is that they'll see it in practice, and then they'll start looking, okay, maybe this, maybe that, whatever. And people like the development industry, the Property Council of New South Wales, the real estate industry, they're constantly making submissions to government in relation to property, housing, etc. The state premier's come out and said it very clearly, I want this to happen. And so the thing is that I think all that pressure and discussion is going to bring in change and amendments to the policy.
Could I just ask a question? George, I think you made a comment, and I'm conscious of everyone's time, you made a comment that as long as your land or lot is within 3% into, is that actually a...
No, it's not. It's not. The 3% is not a requirement.
Okay.
As long as you are in, whether it's 1%, 3%, 5%.
Okay.
You can have a typo.
Okay. Okay. Questions, Theo? Sean?
Just previously you talked about single dwelling is not included in this thing, right? So is it hard, to get approved apartment block or a duplex and have it made back into a single dwelling?
Well, if you're in an R2 zone, you can still get an approval for up to 3 stories.
What about 6
But
stories?
if you're 1 to 6 stories, then you've got to work out land size for it to be viable.
So you're saying get
approval for like a 6-story apartment?
Yeah, I know, but you'll need the land size, which means that I combine it with somebody else so that you can actually make it a viable proposition for a developer.
So you're saying if you had a 6-story building approved in whatever zone, can you convert that back into a single house?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood you.
The answer is probably no, because the intent of the LMR has been to deliver additional dwellings. So that will go back to the council. And you might argue that you've got an approval, you've got an envelope that's approved. So what if you reduce it to 2 dwellings or 1 dwelling, right? I think there's going to be difficulties in doing that.
Duplex easier?
Might be a little bit easier, but if you're reducing the dwelling stock, I think there's going to be a problem there.
And with the affordable housing, does that have to be available for rent, or can it be for a lower price sale?
Only for rent.
Only for rent?
Yes.
Rick, you made a comment earlier around winners and losers.
Yes. And I apologise for those terms.
No, I get it. Obviously, I'm a developer, and what I see is it's now evened the playing field for everyone, because there's now an abundance of supply available to do this medium-sized development, whereas previously you had to amalgamate, or you had to, I guess, you had to buy multiple sites to try and make something
Had
work.
to meet the market, and the market was very few development sites. I spoke to quite a large developer this morning who's just decided in certain areas they're not buying. What am I going to get per square metre rate? They're struggling to get X amount now in a particular market. When 500, 600 other units come on the market, what's my feasibility? And I can't give that feasibility in the future. I did go through this 4 years ago, whenever Rose Bay was rezoned, and I remember talking to my employer at the time, and I still get goosebumps thinking, oh my God, Lou, what's going to happen? How can we sell these things? And slowly they get absorbed. I will also mention that back then, in that rezoning that I lived through, I think nearly 1 in 3 developers didn't complete. They weren't able to. There's so many things to take into consideration. So this was, actually I won't mention the names of some of those developers, but delays in getting approvals through, cost of funding, those developers actually pulled out. So as part of our negotiations with clients, we're trying to work on very healthy deposits. And in all fairness, if our clients are getting extreme premiums, trying to, I'm going to say help the developer to get it over the line. Maybe that's the inappropriate word, I don't know, it depends where you stand on things. But it is going to be, to me, I look at it as a partnership in all fairness. If you're going to get a pot of gold, then there has to be some allowances for that pot of gold in all fairness. But I do predict per square metre rates, if there are no changes to what's been gazetted, there is so much supply out there at the moment that I do think per square metre rates will start to come down a little.
You're talking about the building.
I'm talking about so if you have a property and if it's 1,000 metres of land in the appropriate zoning, and let's say you got the 2.2 uplift of 2,200 buildable area, and let's say, just for mathematics, I was not very good at maths, $10,000 per square metre. What I'm suggesting is that 10,000 square metre, if a developer says, but I've got 2 in that street and 1 in the next street and I've just been offered 3 by such and such in Darling Point, for me to make it work, I'm at 8,000 per square metre. So that's what the buildable area price, I think, will come down. In all fairness, we're already seeing it. We're already seeing certain sites that may have achieved 15,000, 14,000, now possibly trading around the $12,000 mark. And it's happening so quickly.
Yeah, just to give you an idea, I actually got to have a feasibility from a developer I know, and without giving any private details. Without giving any private details away. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I actually have a feasibility from a developer I know, and I'm not giving away private information, but to give you an example, the property was about just under 2,000 square metres. His acquisition cost was 26 million. The construction cost and adding all the other building costs and development costs, it came up to 78.1 million. And sales income came to 103.7 million. Then he had GST to worry about 7.5 million. And then total net profit before corporate tax was 96 million. And then it came down to total net profit with all those deductions, 18.2 million. So return on cost was 23.5%.
A healthy profit, a lot of risk, healthy profit. Yeah. I can say to you, and I think a lot of it...
But that's how it will work, what the developers and working out, does it stack up?
Brian, George, John, myself would be privy at the moment to some developers that actually, due to costs of funding and delays with building that actually have been making no money or minimal profit. So we're not painting a negative picture here, but not everything's rosy for everybody at the end of the day. Is there any other questions before we close up? Brian, is there anything you'd like to, this is Brian Minison, I believe one of the leading architects in Sydney, if not the leading architect in Sydney, that you'd like to add that you've observed?
No, I think the guys have covered it very well, but I mean, all I'd say is speak to the professionals, like George, myself, there are plenty of architects around. If you're not sure, we're covering a lot of these questions we've been dealing with for the last 2 to 3 weeks, almost every day. And they clarify. Yeah, but I agree with pretty much everything. I just do have one question for George, but I'll ask him afterwards.
Is it something that may help to...
I know, just about a R1 residential general in the city council. Does that, you may not be able to answer this.
I think it's the same controls that apply to the R2 zone.
Right.
Because it's a low density zone.
So that wouldn't fall under LMR, right?
It can, no, it definitely falls under LMR. R1, R2, R3, and R4 all fall under LMR. I thought it was going to be a football question.
Funding. Thanks everyone, thanks for attending.